right.
Yeah, so we are live now.
Very good.
Jai Bhim, good evening to all. I'm Dr. Sonika Bodhi, and with me, Dr. Anuradha Bele ma'am is there. So we are yet with another session of this. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Jeremy Rinker. Let me introduce him. Jeremy A. Rinker is an assistant professor of peace and conflict studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Jeremy Rinker is a Ph.D. scholar, has interacted, observed, and studied Dalit anti-caste social movements in India, and his critical comparative approach to India's modern anti-caste resistance. Dr. Rinker emphasizes the complex interdependence between narrative practices and social transformation in understanding the centuries-old caste basis of India's most fundamental social conflict. Through theoretical analysis, auto-ethnographic field notes, and narrative storytelling, Dr. Rinker brings the lived experience of modern Dalits to life for a Western reader unfamiliar with the entrenched nature of India's complex caste dynamics. A timely reappraisal of Indian anti-caste movement in fighting and ideological discord, he incited interest to both students of South Asia and those who want to better understand injustice narration as an important means of structural change. So I welcome you, sir. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I just want to start by saying you can't control the weather, so I'm sorry that Mangesh ji can't be with us. Mangesh and I go back, and I was looking forward to actually seeing him in person because it's been a while since I've seen him. But we go back to about 2007 when I was doing field work in Pune and Nagpur both, actually. In fact, my first trip was to Nagpur. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as a way of introducing myself. And I just want to say thanks for inviting me to Ambedkar Caravan. I've been watching some of the talks by others. I might mention some of them along the way, old friends and other new friends that I've seen popping in and out on Ambedkar Caravan. So I'm excited to be here and to share some of my experience. So yeah, so thank you, and I hope that you guys will find this useful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and it'll tell you a little bit, and I'm going to walk through a little bit of an agenda, what I'm hoping to do today. So hopefully you can see that okay. And so my talk here today is kind of based on a paper that I delivered right before COVID happened, probably the last paper that I've been able to deliver in person was in February 2020 at Ohio University. Some colleagues there put on a conference on religion and peace building. And so I was able to go and give a talk on kind of Hindutva and the role of devotion in kind of combating Hindutva. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that. But before I do that, I want to step through a little bit. So that's a little bit about me. I'm at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. We have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in peace and conflict studies. And some of you might not be real familiar with what that field is. It's a relatively new field of study. And so I thought I might spend a little bit of time, if I can figure out, there we go. Sorry. A little bit of time kind of outlining my agenda for today and then telling you a little bit about beginning to talk about the field. And I partly thought of this because I was able to watch Vivek Kumar's talk a few weeks back. I didn't watch it live because I'm in the United States and your timing, of course, is quite different, 9.5 hours off from mine. So I know it's evening there. So good evening to everybody. For me, it's morning. And I've come into my office in order to make sure I have good internet capabilities to give the talk. But Vivek's comments in his talk, Dr. Kumar's comments in his talk really got me thinking in terms of he was kind of arguing or telling folks who are Dalits to study their field and to get really well adapted to their field and well knowledgeable about their field, and not to necessarily portray themselves as someone who studies caste, right? But that actually studies engineering or business or peace and conflict studies. So I took that to heart, and I thought I would say a few words at the beginning to kind of give you some kind of basic premises of my field and some critiques of the literature on religion and conflict, which is actually part of what the paper I'll talk about does. Part of my paper at the beginning is to kind of critique approaches to this idea of religious conflict. And I think that's a bit of a misnomer, religious conflict. And so I kind of spend some time in the paper talking about that. So I'll go from introducing myself through my field of peace and conflict studies, or through my discipline, to jumping further into this paper that I delivered in February 2020 at a conference. It was called the Baker Peace Conference at Ohio University. And that paper is going to be turned into a chapter in a book that Ohio University Press is putting together from many of the presenters at the conference. And so I'm currently revising it and thinking through how to get it in shape to be published. And so the paper, I hope that we can have some kind of dialogue about the paper itself, but more specifically dialogue on overcoming caste and coexisting in a Hindutva-led India, because you're currently in a context in which the BJP is in power, right? And thinking through how they connect with Hindutva and that kind of Hindu-ness, the idea of Hindu nationalism, and trying to kind of think through how do we coexist in this moment, because the reality is they're not going away, right? So as a peace and conflict studies scholar, I would very much argue that we have to work with, right, and not try to overcome, but necessarily work together with, and think of ways that we can dialogue and have communication. So that part of what I was hoping to do today is really following on to the paper in some ways. The paper hopefully can set up conversation about how we reflect on the polarity between contact and encounter with the other versus devotion to the community or nation. And how do we think that complex reality out? And so as I'm talking about my paper and as you're listening, I would hope that, and I put it in red on this slide for a reason, because I would hope that you would kind of keep the question in red, and I want to return to it at the end of my talk in your mind and just kind of reflect on it over the course of our time together, rather than seeing exclusivist nationalist devotion and inclusive calls for minority rights as intractable polarities or two sides of an argument. How can these worldviews peaceably coexist, right? And so that's what I'm hoping as I'm talking and as I'm framing who I am and what my field is, and making some arguments about Hindu nationalism and devotion and devotionalism, that you can kind of keep that red question on this slide in your mind. So if you want to jot it down, jot some notes down in reflection, I would like very much to hear your guys' thoughts and to hear people's questions and ideas in relation to that particular question of how do we deal with this polarity between, you know, exclusive nationalism and the devotion to the nation versus a kind of argument, which of course Ambedkar Dalits and Ambedkar Buddhists have been arguing for quite a long time for, around minority rights, and not seeing them as kind of intractable or unsolvable issues. So that question I want to kind of keep central as I go through my slides and as I go through my talk. So let me start by, again, introducing myself. I teach in a peace and conflict studies program department here at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. We have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree where students can come back both online and in person and take those degrees in the field of peace and conflict studies, which is a relatively new field of study. It's not a field of study that has been around really more than about 60, 70 years. So in the 1950s, really late 40s, early 50s, post World War II, there's this push towards trying to understand the causes of war and the causes of conflict. So like every social science field, the field of peace and conflict studies, what we call PCS here at UNCG, has kind of starting assumptions. Oftentimes social scientists will say, oh, well, we're value neutral. We don't have any values, right? We're 100% objective. When it comes to social science, I would argue that that 100% objectivity is impossible. So we're not trying to in the field say that conflict is necessarily bad or negative. And so we're not saying that we're against conflict. I want to make that clear. Conflict resolution and peace and conflict studies as a field are very much trying to center conflict in the analysis of conflict to better understand it and to work away from destructive conflict to constructive conflict. And if you think of Dr. Ambedkar, of course he had much conflict in his life and in fact courted conflict at times with Gandhi or with other actors throughout his career. He was courting conflict in order to create change. He was disrupting in some ways, which we see in the US, we have this ongoing protests going on in which disruption is happening. And so conflict can be positive, right? It can have negative, it harms, it can be destructive. And so the field of conflict, peace and conflict studies is really not concerned about getting rid of conflict, but getting rid of destructive conflict and working destructive or violent conflict and working towards constructive or nonviolent conflict. The kind of one of the early theorists in our field, a guy named Lou Kreisberg, has written a book that actually has that title, Constructive and Destructive Conflict. And in that book, he says, if people can understand why conflicts become destructive, they can, quote, develop ways to reduce the harm. And I think that kind of is the goal of peace and conflict studies in some ways, to reduce the harm that conflict might produce. Effective intervention involves what we would call thoughtful analysis, critical analysis. Without such analysis, there is that potential for harm. Even with that analysis, sometimes that can lead to harm. So we have to be very careful about how we're talking about groups, how we're identifying peoples, how we're using narrative. All of these things are really critical to our field. Intervention typically involves some form of contact, dialogue, and or relationship building. And so to actually change the dynamic, there has to be some way that parties come together, come in contact. Gordon Allport wrote about contact theory, which is an important theory within our field. And there has to be some way to bring people together, to dialogue in pro-social ways, and to build relationships if we want to move towards peace. And so that's really kind of where I'm coming from as I write about anything related to Ambedkar Buddhism, social change, caste issues, Hindutva, any of the things that I have focused my attention on really come up and are grounded in this kind of set of assumptions or set of really value commitments to nonviolence that I bring with me from my field of peace and conflict studies. So that's kind of the way of which I can introduce myself. And I want you to continue to keep that question in mind as we talk. My field is really, I think the last thing I'll say in relation to peace and conflict studies is my field is really concerned about theory-informed practice and practice-informed theory, that the two go together. We call this praxis. I actually edit a journal called the Journal of Transdisciplinary Peace Praxis. And the idea of that is that you're bringing together people who have theory and people who have practice experience, activists and others, who can really develop this idea of praxis. Following on from what Paulo Freire Paulo Freire was a Brazilian theorist who talked a lot about praxis, and praxis particularly with people who are from marginalized communities. And so kind of following on this sense of Freirean praxis, the field really tries to integrate theory and theory-informed practice, as well as practice-informed theory, that both sides inform each other. And so that's what kind of animates my work as a peace and conflict studies scholar. So let me get a little bit into the paper itself as I talk and try to talk about the paper I delivered and the kind of approach I'm coming from, now that you have a sense of who I am and what my field is. The two quotes you see on this slide kind of informed some of what I was thinking about as I was developing the paper, and they're actually at the beginning of my paper. Those who neglect religion in their analysis of contemporary affairs do so at great peril. Religion's important, right? Religion oftentimes gets shucked to the side or pushed to the side by kind of realist thinkers in our world. Political scientists tend to discount religion. And in the paper, I really kind of go into a whole conversation about how we need to talk about religion and conflict, that religion can only be understood as a cognate with something else, that religion happens with other things. And so religion and conflict can be a topic that we can talk about. And in fact, we teach a course in our department called Religion, Conflict, and Confrontation, and how those things connect. But oftentimes we hear this kind of discourse in the media and elsewhere that this is religious conflict. And I think that's a different thing, right? When you append the two words together, it's different than saying religion and, it's saying religious conflict is different. And I would argue that religion is used in conflict, but most conflicts are not religious by beginning or by origin, or their cause is not religious. And so I think that it is important for us to engage with religion. The second quote you see here is from The Annihilation of Caste, which I'm sure many of the listeners here are familiar with. There are many Indians whose patriotism does not permit them to admit that Indians are not a nation. They are only an amorphous mass of people. Men do not become a society by living in physical proximity. And I've always been struck by that Ambedkar quote, and kind of trying to figure it out, in particular in relation to not just India, but in relation to the US and some of the context of racial conflict that we see in our country. And I'm particularly reminded of in fact, there's a Hollywood movie some of you might have seen that's recently come out, and I think is live streaming or free streaming now, because it was out in the theaters as Corona hit. It's about Bryan Stevenson and a book he wrote called Just Mercy. It's based on his book Just Mercy. I think the movie's called Just Mercy as well. In that book, Bryan Stevenson, who is a lawyer and civil rights activist who works out of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama in the South, a few miles south of where I am. Bryan Stevenson came to Greensboro a few years back, and I heard him talk about this, but I also have read his book, Just Mercy. And in that book, he talks about the need to be proximate to suffering, right? And so when I think about proximity, men do not become a society by living in physical proximity, right? I think about that quote from Ambedkar, and then I think about Bryan Stevenson's idea of being proximate or being close to suffering, and the need for us to be proximate to suffering. And it makes me kind of wonder or question, what is the role of proximity to suffering as someone who's a white American who doesn't get affected in the same ways that African Americans are in with police and police encounters. I think about that often, as well as a white American who's studying and thinking about caste issues in India. I'm not impacted by those issues, but I surely have tried to make myself proximate to those who are suffering and trying to understand what is that like, and how do we overcome that, and how do we understand that in a way that we can have dialogue and contact with people who might not understand that in the same way. And so those two quotes kind of animate the beginning of my paper. And the paper itself is really based on the problem of communalism. We see it writ large through post-colonial history in India, this idea of communalism, right? And I have problem in quotes, not because I don't believe communalism is a problem, but because I'm really coming from this mindset of polarity. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what polarity is a little while later in my slides, and how we deal with conflicts that are polar opposites in some ways. I think a lot of what that this idea of framing it as a problem, my approach to polarization tries to take us out of the problem-solving mindset. I think oftentimes when we frame it as a problem, it gets set as a problem, and we don't oftentimes think creatively and analytically about how we might be able to engage with that problem. So this slide is just probably nothing new to most of you, highlighting some of the realities of what the problem of communalism looks like. We recently saw it flare up right around the time that my president was there visiting in Delhi. Of course, coronavirus then hit soon after, and it seems like that's completely disappeared from the news. But yet that still happened, and yet people are still suffering from the communal riots, as they call them, the communal violence that happened in Delhi, and was quite orchestrated and planned. It's one of the things that I argue for quite often, is that I think oftentimes the narrative and dialogue that we use to describe violence that happens is self-serving of people in power. And so we hear people talk about riots, we hear people talk about religious violence. We hear people talk about, oh, well, these riots were religious riots or religiously based riots. They were ethnic riots to a large extent. And one of Donald Horowitz, a writer who wrote a book called Why Men Rebel in the 1980s, he argued that he did a lot of study actually in South Asia, not India per se, but Sri Lanka. And he looked at kind of what he called deadly ethnic riots in Sri Lanka. And he said, everybody talks about these as spontaneous, but there's nothing that's further from the truth. That in reality, riots are never spontaneous. They're well planned. They're executed by powerful elites and folks political elites that are attempting to get their interests met and their needs met. And so I think that's the thing when I look at the problem of communalism. The political elite attempt to use religion or ethnic identity to incite strife and violence, right? They use it as a foil, if you will, to try to get their needs met. In South Asia, that's often framed as Hindu-Muslim binary, but also operates on caste and class levels of society. It's commonly understood as a source of seemingly retractable or orgasmic violence rather than planned. And so this idea that it just happened. You oftentimes hear leaders, oh, we had no idea this was going to happen. And it just kind of, people's emotions. You're hearing this now in the United States with what's happening around the protests that are happening after George Floyd's death, right? You're hearing, oh, where did this come from? Many people are saying it just happened. No, it didn't happen. This has been going on for a long time, and people are expressing their frustration, and that was a trigger point to get people to come out. But it wasn't like this just happened, right? And the reaction to it oftentimes is very well planned as well. So the communal violence is often framed as a kind of a popular response to social and economic anxiety by elites and accepted by the masses as a response to fear and shame, or what Vamik Volkan called chosen traumas. That's the typical way in which we understand this idea of communalism or riots that happen, they're often framed in this kind of response as, people feel post British leaving India, we've been wronged, right? And so somehow we have to, this Hindutva narrative, this national narrative is oftentimes tied up in this communalist mindset of we have to kind of show that the shame that we experienced in the past won't happen again, right? Or that oh no, we could potentially be economically or socially in difficulty, and so therefore we have to reemerge and re-show ourselves and kind of show our identity. And so that is all tied up in this idea of what Vamik Volkan calls chosen traumas, that leaders use those stories, those narratives, to recreate those traumas, to retell those stories, to motivate people to come out on the streets. And so what I'm trying to do in the paper and trying to think about, and it's complicated, I've been thinking a lot about how does the kind of bhakti devotionalism of the Indian context play into this. Of course, you can see the obvious comparison in terms of Hindutva and Hindu nationalism is kind of bhakti, love of nation, right? As opposed to kind of the love of God. It's a love of kind of Mother India, or Mother India in some sense becomes the God, right? And so how does that, questions about how that plays into, the way in which change can happen and the way in which movements use those ideas. And so I argue that devotionalism could be a kind of a seedbed for overcoming marginal polarities. And so I know that's a kind of a complex and a complicated and maybe a controversial argument to some extent. Before I do that, let me say a few words about this religion and thing that I was talking about before. Religious belief systems, I think, are commonly seen by my field as well, and have been written about in some of these citations you see on my 6th slide here are some of the big names in terms of religion and conflict. Peace building scholars have really kind of seen religion and conflict as, religion is a cause of, or as a cause of religious conflict, that belief itself and devotion itself is a cause of religious conflict. Mark Juergensmeyer and Oliver McTiernan have both written about this, and certainly we can find examples where that's true. Mark Juergensmeyer goes and follows fundamentalist movements around the world, and interviews people like Timothy McVeigh, or it didn't interview Timothy McVeigh, but actually did a case study of Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh was the one who bombed the Morrow building in Oklahoma in the United States in the 1990s and was sentenced to death. And he claimed religious significance. Osama bin Laden, people like that. And he kind of uses these examples to kind of talk about religion as a cause of conflict. So that's one kind of way in which religion's talked about in my field, and religion and conflict. It's also talked about as a grounds for religious peace building through development of what would be called a strengthened or what Appleby calls even a literate form of religion. And so Scott Appleby talks a lot about this idea of, of course, religion can be a source of peace as well, but it's illiterate and misunderstandings or bad hermeneutics, maybe in some ways, that causes people bad interpretation and false interpretation, that causes people to use it for violence, that causes the people that Juergensmeyer is studying to actually do what they do. And so he calls for very much literacy, for very much the idea of religious literacy, which I 100% agree with. I think is a great thing, but it's only one part of the equation. And then a third kind of tenet or realm of what we talk about in religion and conflict oftentimes is religion and religious belief as a source of ritual healing, interfaith dialogue, or encounter. So this idea of contact and encounter comes up. And so Muhammad Abu Nimer a good friend of mine who teaches at American University, talks oftentimes about contact theory and encounter programs. His dissertation, in fact, was on encounter programs and bringing people together, which again, interfaith dialogue, critical. Part of what I'm arguing for in the paper is that more than just interfaith dialogue or religious literacy or seeing the kind of cause of religious belief as a cause of conflict, we need to focus on ways that devotionalism and ways that faith can be worked on in interfaith dialogue. In intra-faith dialogue, not just between faiths, but within faiths. So Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity need to be talking within their faith about how you engage with the other, right? As opposed to just Hindus and Muslims coming together and having interfaith dialogue. We need to have intra-faith dialogue. And I think that's been a missing component of a lot of what we've done. Mention of devotionalism in this literature on religious peace building is both underattended and I think a critical seedbed for peaceful conflict transformation. It's a critical space where we could be doing more, let's say. I think devotionalism in the Western sense, at least, maybe less so in India, but certainly in the Western sense, devotionalism is kind of equated with almost primordialism, with the, oh, well, that's an emotive response, that it has no rational basis, and that we can't count that. That's irrelevant, right? And I'm arguing in the paper that we need to get rid of that mindset and to try to move towards an understanding of devotionalism as a critical seedbed for change and a critical seedbed for really polar opposites, Hindus, Muslims, castes, high castes. We need to use that as a kind of a way to develop understanding, contact, relationship between polar opposites. And we need to start doing that by working internally in our communities and then moving externally. Moving from intra-faith dialogue to interfaith dialogue, for example. And so let me spend a second talking about polarity. And this is a concept that's rather new to me, but I've been kind of more and more interested in this idea that first was developed by a guy named Johnson, who really worked on organizational development and uses this kind of model of polarity management. And he talks about polarity as manageable and as a way to manage change within organizations. And so he'll go into a big Fortune 500 company, and there'll be a debate about, say, centralization and decentralization of the main office, right? And some people will be on one side and some people will be on other, and there'll be conflict, right? And so he says, but the reality is that a polarity is kind of like this infinity loop that you see on this slide. It's constantly going around and around, and that one relies on the other, that we can't, that it's not an either or kind of an answer. Either we decentralize or we centralize, but it's how do we do that in tandem with each other? And he uses the example of breathing as a way to illustrate how, so we all breathe, right? And particularly as Dalit Buddhists and Ambedkar Buddhists, we're hopefully using our breath to meditate often. So I thought that was a good example to try to explain how polarity works. And so he uses the example of breathing, which we all have to do in order to survive. And so you see at the top, life aerobic efficiency, and at the bottom, aerobic inefficiency and death. So if you breathe, you breathe efficiently, you have life in you, right? If you don't, you die, right? I mean, pretty straightforward. And so he kind of maps on these four boxes: oxygen, too much dioxide, too little oxygen, and clean out carbon dioxide. And in terms of inhaling and exhaling, if you practice this and you decide, oh, I'm not going to exhale, I'm just going to hold my breath, right? You're gonna build up carbon dioxide in your system, and eventually you'll die if you don't let that out, right? On the other side of that, if you decide that you're going to continually try to inhale, then you're going to get too much oxygen, right? And so it's this combination of oxygen and carbon dioxide that our lungs are constantly in symbiosis with, working together on, that is really critical. And so he sees a lot of conflicts, and particularly organizational conflicts is the context in which he's working, as a polarity, that there's really not an either or, but there's a yes and. How do we work together? It's not an either or answer, but a yes and. How do we work with both sides of that polarity in order to create change? And so as I was introduced to this polarity management model, I started thinking about this in relation to Hindutva and the problem of communalism, right? How do we overcome, or how do we build peace from this context in which communal riots are happening, and leaders are using religion in order to kind of, and ethnic identities in order to ferment that unrest, right? And so I think the polarity kind of model, this infinity loop, if you will, and again, using breathing as a kind of a simple example, but if you put in these boxes, more of a kind of communal peace versus Hindutva, right? Or communal getting along versus not getting along, peace versus violence, right? You might be able to see there's a way that these polarities could work together. And I think devotionalism is one space, because we see it in the Hindutva sphere, we see it among Hindu progressives, and we see it among Dalit Buddhists, right? I've meditated and seen devotional chants and experienced the devotionalism within the Ambedkar Buddhist community. And so all these communities have something in common, right? Something that we could build on in order to build a communal peace, if you will, as opposed to communalism. So that kind of a model really is what I was thinking about as I was developing this paper and thinking about it. And I'm continuing, as I said, to develop the paper. Religious belief and identity today are clearly the fulcrum, or if I go back on my slides, this kind of middle point of the slide where the middle of the boxes meet is the fulcrum, right? Religious belief and identity today are clearly the fulcrum between violent primordial retaliation and pluralistic approaches to structural injustice. Devotionalism and devotional networks of belief, interpretation, and practice have long greased that fulcrum. So there is space where we could help that fulcrum flow better, or help that connection, that relationship, that contact happen. The goal of religious peace builders is to ground chosen traumas of the past in proactive devotional networks that narrate these past traumas as intra-religious opportunities for constructing popular religion. And so internally, within those communities, within religious communities, there's a need to kind of talk about those chosen traumas, and to use devotional networks to help ground those realities. And so I argue this because the reality is that Hindutva exists and Hindu nationalism exists, and it's not going anywhere. I don't think anytime soon you're going to have an India that's maybe sometime soon it'll not be led by Hindu nationalists, but that tenet of thought and that ideology and identity are clearly going to be in the Indian polity and the Indian politics for many years. And so I just want to kind of highlight one example of how I think this kind of devotional polarity can be used, this polarity management of devotionalism can be used. In the paper, and I've struggled a bit with the Ambedkar Buddhist part of it, because I've written on Ambedkar Buddhism quite a lot, and I'm trying to kind of tie this in exactly. But I actually use three contexts: Ambedkar Buddhists, Hindutva nationalists, which which much has been written about in terms of fundamentalism, and Martin E. Marty and others have written about Hindutva, and then the third one, a more progressive Hinduism. And so I know in Ambedkar's analysis of Hindus and the riddles of Hinduism, and in fact I have one of the Baugh's books here that I was gifted when I was in India, and it's actually the Riddles in Hinduism, volume 4 of the Baugh's Maharashtrian produced Ambedkar writings. And I think it's interesting that of all the volumes I could have been gifted, I was gifted the Riddles in Hinduism. And so I have it here, and I have one quote I might read from that. But I want to, before I do that, I want to just say a few words about this idea of progressive Hinduism, because I know in Ambedkar's analysis, Hinduism was regressive, right? That to talk of progressive Hinduism was almost sacrilegious, right, to the Ambedkar Buddhist, right, and to followers of Ambedkar, that he wouldn't have possibly put those two words together. But I think they exist, and I have some evidence that they exist, and so I want to talk a little bit about why it's important for us to highlight and to try to bring up this narrative or story of Hinduism as progressive as opposed to just regressive. I think Ambedkar does focus quite a lot on the regressive nature of Hindu traditions, and importantly so in the Riddles of Hinduism. But I think there's also a progressive side of the faith, and increasingly, and maybe it's more of a diaspora Hindu idea, but increasingly progressive Hindus. There's increasingly this sense of progressive Hindus, and we have to learn to live together with the regressive Hindus and uplift the progressive ones. And so as I was kind of studying this, I came across I already said this, but in the paper I compare Hindutva and the RSS movement with progressive Hindu movement, and I came across a group called Sadhana, which is based in New York and has chapters around the United States, and the Ambedkar movement. And so these kind of three different stories I talk about in the paper, these kind of three different stories of how you would overcome communalism and overcome violent, destructive conflict through devotion to and pushing forward a progressive devotionalism, if you will. So you know about the first and the last of these. You know quite a bit about Hindutva and the RSS, particularly those of you in Nagpur, the home of the RSS, right? But you probably don't know about the second, the progressive Hindu. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time saying, yes, they exist, and tell you about a group called Sadhana, which is a small group based in New York. And they're a progressive Hindu devotionalism, a group that focuses a lot on devotionalism. They were founded relatively recently in 2011. They have 9 chapters across the US, again, small chapters. And you see the cities there, including Minneapolis, where we have, I don't know what they're doing in relation to the George Floyd situation in Minneapolis, but I wonder, because that's where he was killed, right? And so it's one of those things I wanna check into more. But they're really mobilizing Hindus and diaspora Hindus in particular for social justice causes. Initially, actually, environmental causes. Their first project was actually in New York on Jamaica Plains, where people would go out and do puja and leave trash. And so one of their early works was to, and they still do this project, was to actually clean up the puja materials, plastics and other things that people were using on that beach. And so it was very much a sense of environmental justice that they wanted to portray. they very much push this idea of oneness of all, nonviolence or ahimsa, and service, right? That those are kind of, for them, Hindu values, just like I have my peace and conflict studies values. They would say these values are core to Hinduism, and they chose sadhana as a name because they wanted to foreground this idea that of praxis, really, that Hinduism is an action, right? That it's a verb, right? That it's not a thing that we just adhere to or believe in, but it's a thing that we actually go out in the world and do. Sounds very similar to Ambedkar Buddhists that I've talked to, right? That our belief is putting that our practice is to put in the work of social justice, is to put in the work towards social justice. And so as I kind of came in aware of this organization just recently, I was kind of struck by how similar in some ways the values underpin what it is that they're trying to do in terms of changing the world. And so they're organizing community transformation in the Hindu diaspora by asking what it means to be a progressive Hindu. They have up on their site a lot of things about anti-caste work, a lot of documents and interviews about that, as well as a lot of, they have ironically, when I got on at first, and what drew me to them was that they have a Hindutva 101, how to talk to your relatives about Hindutva, right? For Hindus, right? And from a very progressive standpoint. So they're a national and transnational or translocal organization. So they're really very much based locally in New York and other chapters where they are, but they're really trying to broaden this progressive human rights perspective of Hinduism, right? And pushing away from a really fundamentalist right-wing version of Hinduism as Hindutva, right? And so I found that fascinating, and I wish there were more groups like this, to be honest. I haven't found a lot of them, right? They're a marginality for sure within the Hindu tradition. So I'm not trying to say, see, all Hindus are progressive. Don't mistake me that way. But what I am trying to say is internally within the faith of Hinduism, there needs to be more groups like this arguing and dialoguing about what it means to be a Hindu and what are the really underlying values of Hinduism. And so they're picking up on a lot of the very progressive values of Hinduism that I think are really needed in this day and age and in this context that we're currently living in. And so again, it's an argument for, the paper really is very much an argument for intra-faith dialogue, the argument, and it's interesting because I was listening to one of the podcasts that one of the founders of this organization was on. It was a New York City-based podcast. I think they have it linked up on their website. If anybody wants more contact on or more understanding of this group, I can tell. I mean, I can share in the chat box or whatever. I can share some links if need be. But I was listening to a podcast of one of the co-founders of the organization, and they were asking her, well, what drew you to this? And she said, well, I've always felt a connection to Hinduism and grew up as a South Asian, actually as a South Asian, mostly outside of the country. She was from South India and did spend a good bit of her childhood there, but then moved. And she basically says the thing that really kind of was the trigger for me to want to start an organization like Sadhana and a progressive Hindu movement was that I was out as a human rights worker, arguing for, protesting at I think it was actually Zuccotti and Occupy Wall Street, where she said, I heard a Hindu chanting, and I thought, oh my God, there's somebody else who's a Hindu, who's progressive, who's out here. And she looked and realized that that person was actually on the other side. They were actually counter-protesting the Occupy movement. And she said, my heart just sunk. I thought, oh, finally I found somebody with like mind. And in reality, no, that person is very much fundamentalist and exclusivist, has a kind of a conservative kind of a mindset different from my progressive values. And so she was like, it just struck me that I had had that experience over and over and over again. And that was the kind of trigger moment that made her realize I need to try to start to organize people who have a more progressive view of Hinduism. And so that is one of the three movements I'm kind of looking at in the paper. So let me jump now to kind of to having some dialogue, because I want to hear from you guys and spend a little bit of time, the rest of our time together, thinking about what you thought of what I had to say and how you think it might apply to Ambedkar Buddhism in particular. This slide just is kind of framing that a little bit. The liberal reaction to Hindutva and communal violence as wrong-headed conception of what Hinduism means, I believe, is naive response to a disturbing worldwide antisocial trend. My argument is that we need to create new ways of dialoguing with Hindu nationalists. They're not going away anytime soon. More than religious leadership, religious literacy, or interfaith dialogue, the traditional tools of religious peacemakers, what is needed are to combat communal violence and Hindutva fundamentalism with a kind of progressive narrative, whether that's Ambedkar Buddhist or progressive Hindu. I argue that intrafaith devotional networks are needed to combat what Sarah Cobb has called narrative violence, that fundamentalist paradigms create and foster. To challenge the chosen traumas, we must share devotional stories. So how should Ambedkar Buddhists be responding to communalism? What are the best practices for responding to events like the ones that recently happened in Delhi? How can devotionalism in India, in the Indian religious tradition, be used as a resource rather than, oh, that should be obstacle, sorry, typo, rather than an obstacle for change, right? So how can they be used as a resource rather than an obstacle? And I think it's devotionalism, that fulcrum of similarity of devotionalism, that could be one spot. It's not the only spot, but could be one spot where we could grow a more inclusive piece. And so that I think I want to open it up now to have some conversation about both these questions at the bottom, how do Ambedkar Buddhists respond to communalism, and this kind of question that I asked early on, which was, rather than seeing exclusive nationalist devotion and inclusive calls for minority rights as intractable polarities on two sides fighting against each other, how can we use these worldviews to peaceably coexist? So I think I'll leave it there and have you guys give me some feedback and some ideas in relation particularly to that question and that idea of how do we engage with these others? How do we engage with people who have really different views than us? Thank you. Do you want me to stop sharing?
I think we can wait. There are quite a few questions coming up. We've shared them with you on the screen if you want to take a look on the chat box.
In the chat, yeah. Yes, okay. So maybe I can start with the first and second big questions that you put, Sonika, in relation to the caste system and racism in the US. I think there are a lot of similarities. There are also quite a lot of differences. Michelle Alexander, who some of you may or may not be familiar with, she's a lawyer, African-American lawyer, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow a few years back. She argued that that we're in a racial caste system in the United States. And so she very much used the language of caste. She didn't, most Americans, to be honest, aren't very aware of Dr. Ambedkar. I mean, he's not a well-known figure in the West. which is unfortunate because I would have liked to see her even bring in some of Ambedkar and tie that together more. I think she makes a good argument that there's been a system created through Jim Crow in the South and then later through incarceration in the more modern era that is very reminiscent and very similar to the caste system. I would say the cultural dynamics, of course, are slightly different, or not even slightly, or quite different. Race is a markered form of inequality, where you see visually the race of a person, right? Whereas caste is not like that. You have dark-skinned Dalits who are in the South, and and light-skinned Dalits who are elsewhere, and so it's you can't by appearance. There's also the idea of graded inequality, right, where caste is, I think, much more complicated, and I think actually U.S. commentators about race oftentimes equate the two, but I think they miss that graded inequality piece, that it's high, high, higher, and low, low, lower. And I'm saying that, and I'm visualizing Mangesh in my mind because Mangesh came to George Mason, where I did my dissertation in 2000. I think that was like 2007, maybe. He came with Maitreya Nath as well, and they gave a presentation, and actually Mangesh said exactly that thing. This graded, he described graded inequality to the students and to the attendees of that event. And I still think about that often, and I thought that was so relevant. The second part of that question about the 22 vows is, it's one of the things that I have a little bit of difficulty, and I'm going to be a little bit honest and critique Ambedkar to some extent here too, which I think is important for Dalits to do, not to just have a devotionalism to him, a blind devotionalism, but to actually critique him. I think the 22 vows are somewhat polemical. They're very pejorative in some ways, and so they're doing what I would, and I'm going to make a bold statement here to some extent in relation to the context of the United States, but they're doing what some, and I don't think all, but what some of the protesters and others are doing in the United States, which is to say it's about us, it's not about you, and in reality, the race issue affects all of us, right, in the United States. And so when you start to create those kind of distinct boundaries of other, it becomes really, really difficult. And I think his Ambedkar's 22 vows do that quite starkly. I had meant to read from the Riddles of Hinduism, the riddle number 1. I was looking back across the volume 4 today, and I was kind of debating whether to read it because I was thinking about it. The first riddle he talks about is the why I am a Hindu. Like, why is it that Hindus think they're Hindus? And in a way, that's very, from the progressive Hindu people I was talking about, that's very problematic, I would think, if you're somebody who says, well, I have a real sense of my values and who I am. But he says in that in that section of the Riddles of Hinduism, it's not a question for every Hindu is it not a question for every Hindu to consider why, in the matter of his own religion, his position is so embarrassing and so puzzling? Why is he not able to answer so simple a question which every Parsi, every Christian, and every Muslim can answer? Is it not time that he should ask himself, what are the causes that has brought about this religious chaos? And so, I mean, I think in some ways that itself is polemical. He's arguing that they haven't really thought through. And I think there are progressive Hindus who have begun to think that through. I think he's right. To a large extent, Hindu nationalists haven't thought that through, right? But there are others who have. And so to kind of starkly place every Hindu in that box can be problematic too. And so, yeah, so I'll leave that comment at that. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that. Do you see Hindutva and Hinduism? Do you see any dignity of Dalit student in Hinduism? Yeah, so I think that's the part of the third question. Do you see any dignity of Dalits and Shudras in Hinduism? No, not really, right? Particularly in the scriptures. And I think that's what Ambedkar was writing the Riddles of Hinduism for, partly, was to kind of outline the places, the inconsistencies in the values and the scriptural writing of Hinduism. And they're certainly there. You could say that about almost every tradition too. I mean, I think, you know, if you take the literalist scriptures, if you take the scriptures literally, then you're going to be in problems. And that's true in Christianity. Literalist Christian tradition, folks, I think is hugely problematic, right? And so, yes, I agree that there aren't really examples of dignity for Dalits and Shudras in Hinduism and in the Hindu scriptures, but each religious tradition is made by people and people remake it. And so if we can empower, because Hinduism's not going away, right? I was at a conference at Nagaloka many years ago where people were talking about Buddhism is going to take over India. And I mean, I love the sentiment, but the reality is not there, right? The reality is you have a country that's 80% Hindu. And so how do you work to recreate that narrative of Hinduism? How do you work to create a more progressive way in which Hinduism can be understood, and work with those who might want to empower that version of Hinduism because religions aren't made in a vacuum. They're created by people and they change and evolve over time. And so Hindutva in reality, and I talk about this a bit in the paper, is really a product of colonialism, right? I mean, it comes out of this kind of period of the 1920s and on of colonialism. And so it's also very much a created hermeneutic or a creative interpretation of the faith tradition. I think a problematic one, but I think we could empower much more powerful and progressive versions of that aren't problematic, right? So that would be my response to that. So the next question is yours, Dr. Bele. Since conflict mostly benefits the political class, special case of India, where religious binarism has kept the political divided flowing from ruling party, how do you see a way forward to conflict resolution, constructive one, as the speaker has pointed out? Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is that just to say what I said right a second ago, I think it is the way forward is not to kind of demonize the other side, which we're in I mean, I'm speaking from the United States, where we're in a situation right now where we have a leader who that's all he does. He gets on Twitter and demonizes the other, right? And I find that hugely problematic, polarizing, and not productive, right? And so I think we have to call that out, and then we have to work with people who are of a more progressive mindset to build movement and to build coalition, both internally within their faith tradition or within their community, and then move that to an external. So I do think it is I'm not arguing that this happens overnight, right? And that this happens all at once. I think actually internally there's a need for dialogue and connection within communities, and then from there moving outward and trying to build coalitions of people of like mind. And I think if India or the United States was successful in doing that, we wouldn't have a Donald Trump or a Narendra Modi. They're the actual symptom of an illness and of a sickness. They're not where we should be, and they're where we could get past if we could build those coalitions. So let me see. I'm just trying to see what other questions are there. Others who want to chime in or respond to my framing question? Yeah, so your question as well about, is it possible to define nationalism in the context of Hindu religion objectively? Yeah, that's an interesting one, because nationalism, of course, predates Hindutva for sure, right? Yeah, so Mangesh just texted me on unfortunately, he must have some weak internet. I will respond to him and try to I was looking forward to being able to engage with him some, because he has a deep understanding of Dr. Ambedkar and his writings, deeper than I. I mean, I'll be honest, I am not an Ambedkar scholar necessarily. I'm not somebody who is, I mean, you could spend your entire life reading Ambedkar because he was so prolific. And I'm not somebody who has a full grasp of everything he wrote and every idea he had. And I don't know that there are very many people who are that, although there are a few of us. People like Vivek Kumar is one of them. You know, and I have great respect for those folks, and I'd love to hear their perspective on like what other things Ambedkar might have said that might feed into this argument of building coalition, because I think a lot of what his career was about and what his action and work was to create coalition. Back to the question of nationalism. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, and a lot of religious. So I didn't say this before, but my master's degree work was actually in religious studies. And, you know, there's great debate within that field about how you define the word religion, right? And when you come to South Asia, oftentimes people talk about the dharmic religions, and they talk about, you know, about South Asian religions as being kind of qualitatively different than Western traditions in ways that involve bhakti devotion, involve you know, dharma as a kind of way of life and a philosophy versus a kind of a dogma. And so there's this whole kind of and so some people would argue that nationalism is more of a Western version of religion, and that it is a religion in itself, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering the question. I think you can talk about nationalism, of course, outside of Hinduism without, you know, but I think what the Hindu nationalists have done is very conveniently for them kind of connected this idea of an ethnicity with nationalism. So Hindus, if you're not a Hindu, you're not an Indian, is their kind of mantra, right? And so the Hindu ethnicity has become, so in some ways it's less of a religious sense of Hinduism in Hindutva than it is a kind of an ethnic sense of Hinduism. And so that gets into questions about, you know, voluntary versus ascribed traditions, right? And traditionally Hinduism wasn't something, I mean, and that's maybe one critique one would have of sadhana. If you look on their website, traditionally Hinduism wasn't a tradition that one could voluntarily become, right? I couldn't choose as a white American, hey, I'm going to be a Hindu. But you know what? Now I can if I want to, right? It's become a voluntary tradition. And if you look at the website of sadhana, that's one thing that is striking, is the diversity. It's not just all South Asians, right? There's actually some people that are white Americans walking hand in hand with, you know, and it's unclear to me, do they consider themselves Hindu, or are they coming from other faith traditions and working with this group? But I think that's a distinction that's happened over the last, say, 100 years or so in Hinduism, is that really since Swami Vivekananda came and talked at the 1893 World's Fair, right? When he came and talked about Hinduism, and people in the West were like, what is this? You know, and they really didn't have much knowledge of it. It's really opened up into much more a voluntary tradition now, where traditionally that wasn't the case. You were born into the tradition, right? And in India, I think that's primarily still true, right? That you're born into the tradition. And so, yeah, so I mean, I could go on that, but I'll maybe leave that one as well, because that's a big one. The present Hindutva has Brahman Dharma in its core, and Hinduism name is used as a shield. Do you agree? Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to what I was saying before. It's an elite form of Hinduism, and they've conveniently kind of, for the masses, tried to create it as an ethnic identity, right? To try to connect it, and one might say, from again, coming from my field of peace and conflict studies, that what the Hindutva, the RSS, and the BJP and others have really done very adeptly is to perpetuate a kind of a cultural violence on society. And Johann Galtung talks about cultural violence and the use of symbol and the use of cultural elements. So like kind of using Hinduism and the cultural realities of Indian life to then say, see, you're a Hindu, but it's more of an ethnic identity. And if you're not that, then you must be Muslim or you must be something else, and you're not really Indian. And so they've used this kind of symbolic representation and as a way of kind of perpetuating a cultural violence that's underpinned by what Galtung would call a structural violence, right? And so structural violence is, of course, the system perpetuating violence against people and not allowing Dalits to participate, for example, as a form of structural violence. And so it's this kind of nexus of cultural and structural violence that the fundamentalist Hindus and the Hindutva folks have really been adept at using. And so I think, again, I'm always thinking, okay, that's a form of perpetuating destructive conflict. How do we make that constructive? How do we work with that, not try to eradicate it, because we'd like to eradicate it to some extent, and not annihilation, right? Ambedkar used that term. That in some ways is polemical too, right? To annihilate. Of course, we want to annihilate caste, and we want to annihilate false ideologies or problematic ideologies that lead to communalism. But how do we do that in a way that that allows for non-harm, ahimsa, right? That allows for because I strongly believe, and I didn't maybe focus on this so much. The other part of what I've done in my writing and research has been around collective historical trauma and issues of trauma. And I strongly believe that violence perpetuates trauma, and that anytime you have violence, there's going to be a legacy that's going to last far into the future. And so if there's any way we can curtail violence and be nonviolent, that solves, or that serves all of us, right? It serves not just marginalized, but the powerful as well. I see that you say we're done with questions. So how many, can I ask before we get off, how many folks were on live? Can you see? Because I only see us three.
Yeah, so we'll come to that, sir. Before that, Dr. Anuradha will give vote of thanks to all the viewers. And
okay.
Yeah. So Dr. Jeremy, would you like to say a few words before we move on to the vote of thanks?
No, go ahead. You do the word of thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jeremy. I, on behalf of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Caravan and Mangesh Dahiwale sir, extend our gratitude to our speaker, Dr. Jeremy Rinker from University of North Carolina, for explaining about the dialogue on overcoming caste and coexisting in Hindutva-led India, and how the field of peace and conflict studies through effective intervention and analysis through contact, dialogues, and relationship building will bring together a way of relationship building. We looked at ways of bringing theory and practice together through praxis. We also looked at the problem of communalism, the paper that Sir has authored, and the explanation of important terms like chosen trauma, devotionalism, and the polarity management map. We also heard stories of how to overcome violent destructive conflict through progressive devotionalism and intra-faith devotional networks to combat narrative violence. We also had a very interesting question and answer session today, which delved more into nationalism and religion. It was a pleasure to have you with us today, sir, and we hope that this is the beginning of many more such interactions. Thank you once again. Jai Bhim, Namo Buddha.
Jai Bhim, and thank you all so much for listening in and for allowing me to yab on for so long. But I do enjoy it, and I do enjoy making the connection back again with old friends from the Manuski and TBMSG communities. And I will reach back out to Mangesh because I want to say hi and have a chance. We've just been chatting by text, but it would be nice to get a chance to. It's always nice to see people's faces. So I'm glad to meet the both of you, and thank you so much for listening and participating and giving me the opportunity. So Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim. Sir,
Jai
please
Bhim, sir.